So, Jess, what do you think is the most consumed form of meat in the United States in 2024?
I mean, I think my guess would probably be beef, but I don't know.
That is
I
wrong, especially because we're here today to talk about chicken. That should have been your hint. It's actually chicken. As at least in 2023, which is the last year I have data, chicken was the
Mhm.
most consumed meat in the United States. It's been that way since 2010 when chicken surpassed beef as the number one meat. And it actually surpassed pork back in 1996 as the number two meat. So over the last, 30, 40 years, chicken has been steadily rising in terms of its prominence on the American dinner plate.
Chicken breed by day, chicken dance by night.
That's interesting. We eat a lot of beef. I'm always shocked when I talk to people and they eat as much chicken as they do, but I'm interested to learn how this happened.
Well, I mean, you're right because it's interesting because it wasn't always this way. In the 90s, pork was more prominent even than chicken.
It's where we're at, it's what you want, it's on your mind, it's in your mouth, it's pork, and it's catching on. The other white meat.
And even if you go back like 50, 75 years ago, chicken was like more a specialty food, right? Like
Right.
the fancy Sunday chicken dinner was a thing because chicken was rare. Chicken wasn't the thing that everybody consumed on a daily basis, you know?
Yeah, I definitely have some thoughts about how I'm a blank slate coming into this. I specifically did not research because I really wanted to, like, learn from you and what you're sharing. But growing meat, I had some thoughts on the front end, just like common sense as a person who grows meat. It's a lot easier to grow beef than it is to grow chicken, at least the way that we do it. That is why I'm like, man, it's surprising. But I guess most meat isn't grown the way that we do it. So
That is also true. And it was funny too, because I was like looking at it to say, well, is this something that like happens just in the United States or is this that something that happens all over the world? The answer is chicken has risen in prominence across the world, but in America especially, where in 2021, which Americans consumed about 128 pounds per person per year of chicken, which
wow.
compares to about 83 pounds per person per year of beef, 66 pounds of pork, and surprisingly, only 1.5 pounds of sheep or goat. So there you go.
Hmm.
And in
Well,
like other countries, it's not nearly as high, particularly as a relative number. I think Argentina and Brazil are the only ones that kind of come close to us in terms of the amount consumed. But yes, America loves its chicken, and it didn't used to be this way.
yeah, I mean, I remember it being different.
Right, but I mean, I'm even talking like before you and I were even
Right.
born. Like if you go back, like think about like the start of like colonial times, like in like the
Oh, yeah.
1800s, right?
Yeah.
And to you, what was the stereotype of the typical American farm, and what role do you think chickens traditionally played in that space?
Egg layers for sure. I mean, that would be what people kept chickens for, and then, I mean, you hear the stories or read in books and stuff. It was as you said, like, you would wring the neck of an old hen or a young rooster, to put in the frying pan or in the stew pot as a special occasion, or if you had some need to cull that bird, like, what nobody was raising chickens for the sake of eating them for meat at that
It,
time.
that's exactly right. And that was one of those things that happened throughout back in the olden days, but even like, following the Civil War, right? As Americans started to move more and more towards cities and industrialization happened, there was this need for farm fresh food for people who were no longer living on farms. And
Mm.
eggs were turning out to be a phenomenal form of protein because they're relatively shelf stable. They last a relatively long time. If you're careful and you don't jostle them too much, they're not too hard to transport. And so, as cities grew in America, so did the prominence of eggs in the American diet.
Well, they also are just relatively affordable to produce too. I'm sure that was a big factor too, because a chicken's gonna lay an egg pretty much every day as long as it's fed and cared for, so It makes sense. It's a very sustainable meat source. You don't eat it and then have to start over with a new animal, raising it up from
Right,
scratch.
I mean, like, that expression of killing the golden goose came for a very specific reason. So, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much how it worked. The chicken on those small little farms was typically, kind of providing eggs, maybe pest control, maybe helping make compost, maybe helping deal with the kitchen scraps, like, all of those things were the actual role of chickens on farms until egg laying specialization really came more and more to prominence in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century or so.
It makes sense, I always joke about how I guess it's not a joke, but, like, having all these animals that I care for, we always have our plan B, like, if something were to happen and we couldn't go get the feed that we typically get, or the mill that we order from couldn't deliver, and feed was gonna become an issue, one of the first things we would do is put all the extra birds in the freezer and keep a small free-range flock purely for egg laying, because when it comes to sustainability's sake, I mean, chickens are worth the most for their eggs on a small farm. They can eat
Completely.
scraps and stuff. So, yeah, that totally makes
Exactly.
sense. So
Yeah.
what
And,
happened?
and, well, I mean, here's actually, this is the other thing that I was surprised by. And as a person who owns a lot of chickens myself, I didn't even think about until I started to do this research where, number one, the other reason that chickens weren't really a big deal on farms back in the day was because of predators.
Mm.
So, you think about it, right? Like, I don't know how it is at your place, but at my place, we use poultry netting, we use electric fences, we use hardware cloth, we use welded wire fencing as a way
Oh,
to
yeah.
keep and manage our flocks. And those are all things that make it really, really easy to keep the predators out. Back in the day, they didn't have
You didn't
those
have any of
things.
this.
So, it was
Yeah.
easier for a weasel to get in there or a mink or, some of those more wily predators that could, slip their hand in and grab some chickens. That was
Oh,
much more of a
sure.
thing. And so, until you had sort of our industrial production methods, until you had things like electric fencing, it was harder to keep chickens back in the day too.
Well, yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense when we used to just have a static coop in the woods, and we had a fence around it, but it was just like a 4-foot fence. If we forgot to close the door by dark, I mean, there would be possums or raccoons in our coop almost every single night. I mean, that's why we keep electric netting around it now. We live at a different place, but that's very interesting. I wouldn't have even considered that.
Yeah, no, I was shocked by that one too, and so it was this combination of an increase in technology as well as this demand for feeding America's cities that helped get chickens to be more prominent than just like a tiny, tiny little niche that wasn't even a major part of the everyday diet on the farm, to actually have farms spring up where all these farms were doing was producing eggs to help feed people.
That's really interesting. My neighbors, they live in, I don't know if you stayed over there whenever you came to visit. That house used to be a chicken house, their house that they live, and it was like a commercial chicken house, and they raise birds simply for egg production, but that was in, like, the 1980s. But
Yeah,
anyway, they broke down a bunch of it and then converted to actually live in it now, it's really cool,
right.
but
Well, but that's just the thing. If you look at that period from say the 1860s all the way up into, yeah, pretty much the 1980s, like you're saying, the idea of commercial egg production was a pretty regular thing, and it was done on a not small scale, but like a medium-sized scale
yeah,
where,
that's what
you
they
know,
were.
like most egg producers today are massive scales with
Yeah.
10,000 birds wandering around in several different warehouses that they have them in. Even over the kind of kind of around the time we were born, as well as the years before, they were actually
Mhm.
smaller, less centralized operations back around those times.
Yeah, that's definitely what they had, was something kinda independent, but that was still a viable thing, and then they ended up stopping when it was no longer really a viable thing.
Exactly. And so with this demand in eggs, you had farms specializing in egg production, and that actually brings us to the part of the story where we end up in Delmarva. Now, do you know Delmarva?
Mm-mm.
All right, so
And
shocking me, my father actually went and retired in Delmarva, but Delmarva is that peninsula of Delaware and Maryland, like that kind of just juts out into the water there, just
Uh-huh.
on the eastern seaboard. And it was in the Delmarva area, actually, a small town in Delaware specifically, where a woman named Celia Steele, who actually had a little farm with her husband, even though they did a lot of other things. She actually one spring in 1923 put in her order for 50 egg laying chickens. And now that order of egg laying chickens pretty much changed everything when it comes to the American diet. And let me get into why. Because when she was writing it down on the hatchery order form, she actually made a mistake and it looked like it said 500 chicks. And so rather than getting 50 chicks, they delivered 500 chicks to her little farmstead.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, I was
I'm
actually
just
when I was
thinking this is the kind of thing that would happen to me.
yeah, I know. I was thinking about that too. I'm like, well, so if that would happen to me, right, where it was like literally 10 times the number of birds that I was expecting, how would I try to make do and like keep that number of birds? And what would I do? Like, because for people who've never ordered chicks through the mail and had them show up at the post office, there's
You
no
can't send 'em
return system.
back.
You
Yeah.
can't no, it's not like you're,
Yeah.
printing off the label from Amazon, slapping it on a box and putting in a
Yeah.
UPS box and calling it a day. It doesn't work that way with chicks. Those are now your birds, and you have these like 500 living, peeping animals inside your possession, and you've got to figure out how to house them.
I can't fathom 500 chicks. Can I tell you a story? One of the craziest things I've ever seen in my life. So this has been several years ago. You're not gonna believe the scale of this. I'm gonna find the pictures and send it to you because I have like some clips and pictures. It's been probably 6 or 7 years ago. I was in Northwest Alabama visiting my friend Daniel, and we were just driving back in. I mean, this is very rural Alabama, and we're driving through this back road, and we turn around the corner, and there's, like, a chicken in the road, and I was like, "Hey, look, a chicken." And it's, like, early on in me homesteading, and I would stop and just wanna look at everybody's chickens. I still actually do that, honestly, but, like, I I'm like, "Look, a chicken." And we come around this curve, and there is this really, I mean, pretty cluttered, large property, large tall fence on the front, barn in the back. I can't remember if it was like a trailer or a real rundown house, like a, rundown rural property in the South, like what you would expect to see. They're everywhere around here. And within this fenced area, I'm not exaggerating. There were over 1,000 chickens, and they were not just like random, like, they weren't, like, all white chickens, it looked like someone ordered, like, the surprise layer, heavy brown layer blend from a hatchery and got 1,000 of them, and they were everywhere. I literally couldn't handle it. I stopped, I took so much video, I've never seen anything like it. We tried to go back and see it again, like, a while later, and they were all gone, and so I wonder if they accidentally messed up their order. It
I
was
mean,
bizarre.
it's
It was
possible. Like,
bizarre.
that's a lot of bird like, I always reach this point here on our farm every summer where we have so many hatchlings and so many birds going on, and I'm just like, it's usually somewhere like in like early mid-August where I'm like, this is chaos. I can't take it anymore. And like, it's like a stress that I don't feel until I have like my butchering days in the fall and then
Yeah.
like shrink the farm down to kind of like what it is right now. That it's like when you have that many birds, there's like a multiplying factor. It's like, yes,
Yes.
there's not that much difference between keeping 10 chickens and 12 chickens, but 10
Yes.
chickens versus 100 chickens versus 500 chickens versus 1,000, that makes a
Oh, yeah.
massive difference.
If you've ever been in the presence of that many chickens, of course, I've been in commercial chicken houses and stuff like that. It is very overwhelming. This particular instance of that place I have no clue where those birds were roosting or sleeping. It was literally like every handful of feet on this entire property, there were chickens. Like, it was overwhelming. I have to find pictures and send this to you, and I told you, you can't grasp the magnitude of what I'm saying. It was the most overwhelming chicken experience I've ever had. It
I
made no sense. That I can't I feel dumbfounded right now of the memory of the time. So
Well,
crazy.
all right. So then I guess you telling me that says that you can probably identify with our girl Cecilia, or I'm sorry, Celia, and the feeling she had as she's picking up these 500
I
chicks and
can't
trying to
yeah.
figure out what to do with them. She ended up taking a shed that they had and she put like a little coal heater, like, or a coal stove inside the shed because, again, if you have baby chicks, you need to keep them warm. This is 1923 where they don't have brooder plates or the heating accessories that we would typically rely on in this day and age. And so
Yeah.
in a tiny 256 square foot barn or shed, like, here, I'm going to show you a picture here in a second of what it looks like. She kept 500 chicks. So here, I'm going to show you what this area looked like, because it was kind of nuts, actually.
I used to hatch out, chicks and sell them to my local feed store, and I would hatch 80 at a time, and so I know how much space that takes, and I wouldn't keep them past the first day. So I just yeah, that 500 is a lot.
It's very much. And so here is what she's got. So this is the steel house. If you go down to Delaware and want to visit it, this is what it actually looks like. And now again, think about the space requirements. Picture 500
Yeah,
chicks living in that for about a month or two. And
yeah.
yeah, that kind of becomes next level as
That
well.
might would fit them the first, like, 3 or 4 days, like, feasibly, but beyond that, it was gonna get pretty cramped in there, I'm sure.
I know. It's kind of, to me, it's kind of mind-boggling that they were able to do it, but that is how they kept
Yeah,
them. And so she had these 500 chicks. She started raising them in there. She lost 100 of those 500. So that's a 20% mortality, which is also kind of nuts. Like, for folks who aren't familiar with raising chicks, right? Like, you're always going to maybe lose one or two. That happens. It's just part of
yeah.
life when you're raising baby chicks and baby birds in general. But I don't know, Jess, like, what are your mortalities typically looking like for like some hatchlings or even a batch of like meat birds or something that you're raising on your farm?
If we get 100 birds in, we may lose 1 or 2. It's usually right off the bat where there was obviously, like, a little bit weaker or something like that, and then maybe over the course of the next until they're feathered out and moved out, 6 weeks old, like I'm sorry, like, probably 3 weeks old, we may lose another one, like, if they pile up on them or something like that, but not a lot. I mean, never 20%.
Yeah, I mean, as I track my mortality on my farm with chickens specifically over the last like 5, 6 years, it's usually ranged somewhere between 1% and 4%. And so like 4% would be a bad year in terms of chick mortality. Our girl Celia here is losing 20% because, again, probably she just wasn't that used to raising that many birds in
Sure.
that fell swoop. And so kind of do have some empathy for her on that front.
Oh, for sure, and also it's not like she chose to get into that, I mean, like, she was trying to keep 500 birds alive. I mean, honestly, if you have that many animals in that small of a space, I mean, just in that, they'll smother each other, so, like, I can understand why that happened, but I don't necessarily fault her. It's not like she chose to order them, so
Right. Exactly. Again, these were, of these chicks, like 450 of them were a surprise for her.
Right. That building would have been great to raise out 50.
Oh yeah, 50,
But
that is the exact right size of a shed that you'd want. But yeah,
yeah.
so she raised them out, and ultimately when they were about between 2 and 2.5 pounds, she and her husband butchered them and sold them. And they decided to sell them to people and see if they could sell them as meat birds, which before she did this was never ever a thing that was done. And there you have the big innovation. And she actually ended up charging the equivalent, if you adjust for inflation, of about $11 per pound for these birds. And these like I said, they were between like 2 and 2.5 pounds in terms of like a hanging weight when all was said and done, which
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I'm sure kind of your numbers. Like when you guys do chickens, how heavy are they usually? Like,
I mean, now with Cornish crosses, I mean, we're processing out and dressing out 8-pound birds, like, once they're dressed because we raise ours longer, but still, like, yeah, we're raising modern breeds for that. I
right.
mean,
And,
we've
and I,
processed excess roosters before, and maybe they were a few pounds dressed, like heritage breeds, like
so I have this data because I just got through the process of processing about 2 weeks ago, 30 rooster chicks that I hatched out, raised up over the summer, and now that becomes like the meat that my wife and I are going to eat over the course of this year. And basically they were averaging between 3.5 pounds and 5 pounds. And they were a variety of different breeds. There was no Cornish cross in there. It was everything from like Bantam crosses to we had like American breasts
Yeah.
crosses in there. And so it was like a good diversity, but they topped out there and that was for non-intended meat birds. And so
Yeah.
her birds, relatively speaking, compared to the modern bird, is also significantly smaller.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that said, though, if you're charging $11 inflation adjusted per pound, you're making a pretty hefty profit on those birds, even if you're only raising 2-pound birds. And so Celia decided to do it again the next year, and then the next year after that, and the year after that. And by 1926, so remember, her accident happened in 1923. By 1926, she her operation had expanded up to 10,000 chicks in a year.
Wow.
So remember that farm that you found? Like, she was operating on that same scale at that point.
That
Yeah,
is crazy.
she went from the 500 accidental in 1923 to the 1,000 in 1924 to 10,000 by 1926. And Celia's neighbors also started to take notice. And they saw how much money she was making and how she was doing this and how easy it all was. And so by 1927, just within that peninsula of Delmarva that I was describing earlier, there were over 500 farms who were raising chickens for meat commercially. And so, ta-da, a brand new industry was born in the span of about 4 years.
Well, that's interesting. I just would not have ever I don't know, that's surprising to me. I don't know why, but I didn't know that.
Well, I mean, I think for me, when I first heard about this, I was surprised because it was just so accidental and so haphazard. And so the thing that like dominates the American like meals of today wasn't even a thing if you go back about 100 years ago. Like it was
So,
just being born.
is that region now and this is why it's surprising to me. Actually, I do know. There are commercial chicken houses everywhere here. That's the industry here. Actually, in, like, my particular region, specifically in the Midlands of South Carolina, like, very near my house is a massive, like, commercial chicken processing plant, which many of the chicken houses in the area bring their chickens to be processed. I mean, this is, like, a handful of miles from my house, not even, it's really close. And there are multiple places around here, like, this area and then where I lived previously in Arkansas, which is still the South, like, a different kind of part of the South, more Midwestern, but, like, tons of chicken houses there, and so I have kind of thought as commercially raising chicken as being a Southern thing because everywhere you go here, there are just huge chicken houses. It's a big part of the agriculture here, so it's surprising to me. I would have guessed that it had roots here
Well, it
beyond that.
actually it probably geographically kinda kept spreading from area to area to area, and so you go
Mhm.
from one county to another, and, you're not relatively that far away, but actually that Delmarva region really started out as the epicenter for raising chickens, and even to this day, they have a pretty sizable industry of poultry there, and, like, the biggest factors too, other than the fact that, like, this, like, little shipping glitch that Celia experienced was the fact that, number one, it's close to a lot of major cities, very, very close to Philadelphia, very close to New York, very close to Washington, D.C., like even like go to further south down to like say Charleston. Like, and so you had relatively good access up and down the eastern seaboard for distributing your product. And then the weather and the climate there actually has significantly less extremes.
Mhm.
So the summers are not nearly as hot as what you experience,
Right.
and the winters aren't nearly as cold as what I experience up here in Vermont. And so the combination of those 2 things also really helped lend to that region being really successful. And then at the time, land was wicked cheap down there, and so you could easily buy some
Right.
land, put up a couple of sheds, and start raising meat birds in that one area. And to what you just alluded to as well, that's where a lot of the original poultry processors who were doing it at scale started to spring up as well. And so it is like a lot of other things in life, right? They sort of spring up out of the same geographical location.
That's interesting. So I guess it's safe to assume that during that period of time, it was probably still something of a novelty, like, and a high-end eating experience. Like, right now, if I go to one of, like, our favorite fine dining restaurants over in Colombia, like, there may be shark on the menu or, like, they'll have something a little more specialty like quail, like, this I guess that during this time, you'd go and get chicken. Prob
That's very accurate. It still didn't quite dominate the American plate. And again, remember, they were charging the equivalent
Yeah, it
of
was
$11 a
expensive.
pound.
Yeah.
When I raise like my fancy high-end goose, I'm charging 14 a pound these days. I think about like some friends of mine who do like organic, non-GMO fed chicken here, and they're charging around $6-ish a
Yeah.
pound these days. And so like if you think of the high end of chicken prices today, it was almost half of what it was back then.
Well, yeah, because, like, right now, if I, as a farmer, raise a pastured, organic, I mean, top of the line chicken, like the best chicken you can get, I'm still competing to a consumer with the, l you know, completely commercially raised $1.97 a pound meat, you know?
Right.
I don't
Right,
know that it
which
really costs that much anymore, but, like, still, I mean, just that it no longer am I producing something that's seen as specialty. It's
completely.
just a replacement for something that's so common that people are like, "What? You want $28 for that whole chicken?" And I'm like, "That's to break even," like,
Yeah, it's
so
not that extreme.
yeah, yeah,
Well,
that's
and
interesting.
so, I mean, that was kind of the other thing that surprised me, and it got me wondering, well, like, well, how did things go from this, like, relatively still niche product that was kind of a luxury to, being something that people are eating, like, 130 pounds of a year? And so, with Celia's experiment there, she became kind of an innovator. She was introduced into the Delaware Women's Hall of Fame in 1983. Her house and like their original farm, like I showed you in the pictures, is
Mhm.
now a historical landmark. But sadly, actually, Celia and her husband died in Ocean City, Maryland, back in 1940 in a very tragic accident that often befalls chicken farmers. Can you guess what it is?
I'm not sure. What I don't know. I don't know what the risks of chicken farming are.
A yacht explosion.
I was like, ammonia
Yeah, no, I know
asphyxiation? I don't
that would
know.
make sense, like ammonia, tripping and getting pecked to death by cannibal chickens, like, I could see all that, but no, apparently, like, once they, like, hit it big as chicken farmers, they started to live the high life, and, yeah, they were out boating and their yacht exploded,
Oh gosh,
which I
that
know, I
is
feel
very
horrible
tragic.
laughing, but I don't know, maybe it's not too soon at this point.
Tragedy plus time equals comedy.
Here's the thing though, when it came to what she was doing, she was still doing like traditional egg laying breeds. Like I couldn't find exactly what it was, but picture like doing like, I don't know, like a Rhode Island red chicken
Yeah.
or a Leghorn chicken for meat. You're still not going to get much. And so the real thing that you need to do is actually figure out how do you grow a bigger, more feed efficient chicken. And that is where the Chicken of Tomorrow contest of 1948 sprung up.
Hmm.
Now, Jess, are you familiar with the Chicken of Tomorrow?
Cluck, cluck, here comes the truck with the chicken of tomorrow. Oh, what luck! Breeding fast, growing wide, with plump thighs and breasts that can't hide. Raise 'em big, raise 'em right, in the day and through the night. For A&P, it's quite the sight. Win that prize, make it tight.
The A&P food stores, the nation's largest poultry retailers, offered to sponsor a contest for the development of superior meat-type chickens. A national committee was full of the program, The Chicken of Tomorrow, to end with a national contest in June 1948. A&P offered $10,000 in cash prizes as a supplementary attraction to the program. The Delmarva Chicken of Tomorrow Queen, Nancy McGee of Berlin, Maryland, What will tomorrow's meat type champion be? Even today, housewives are enjoying improved meat type chickens. They sure make wonderful eating. Yes, sir. Make mine chicken. Chicken of tomorrow, that is.
I did not know that this was the origin. I know what the chicken of tomorrow is today, I assume, but, I have not heard of this contest, no.
After all these years, whether the chicken or the egg came first is still the subject of a lot of good-natured debate.
No, it isn't.
In 1948, the USDA and the A&P grocery chain decided to have a contest to try to produce and breed a type of chicken that was larger, meatier, and more economically viable. Again, now this is post World War II in 1948. You have an explosion of agricultural technology coming into play. You have the baby boom and more people being born in the United States. And so figuring out ways to feed people and essentially create a universal chicken that had more breast meat, faster growth, better feed efficiency. These were the things that everybody was looking for. And so across America, farmers started to find breeding combinations that could produce larger and larger and meatier chickens.
Yeah. I mean, I understand the need for that. Like, when I first started in homesteading, everybody talks about dual purpose birds. These are great for eggs and for meat, and they talk about those heavier brown egg laying, heavy layers and all that stuff. And I'd read all the homesteading books, so obviously I knew how to do everything. And I was like, I need dual purpose birds so we can eat the extra ones and eat the older ones. And I got 31 Rhode Island red chicks from a local guy, a straight run. And like majority of them actually ended up being roosters. It was like over 20 of them were roosters. And so when they were 18 weeks old, we decided to go ahead and learn how to butcher, and we processed all those roosters. And as I mentioned, I mean, they were all within like they dressed out the breast meat was this thin. They're not meat birds. They're just heritage breed roosters. They're lightweight and they dressed out at a few pounds each. Plucking them was a nightmare. We didn't have any equipment, so we did it all by hand and eventually just started skinning them and ended up realizing at 18 weeks, birds are already getting kinda tough, so when I tried to fry them, they were really stringy, and so, yeah, like, that's when we started raising Cornish cross at that point, which is the chicken of today, but I totally get it would not make financial sense to try to build an industry on such little return.
Completely. And so that's where this contest actually helped promote a bigger and better bird. And so by the end of the contest, the winning breeds were about 40% faster in terms of growth, and they reached their market weight of a little bit over 3 pounds in just 12 weeks, which is pretty good. And if I think about like what I do with like my little rooster experiments that I do on my farm when we harvest our chicken,
Mhm.
it's kind of in the same ballpark. It's not too far off from that in terms of both the size as well as the time that it takes to do it. But, just since we raise Cornish cross, like how long are you typically raising those birds? And again, how much are they weighing for folks playing along at home?
Well, we do things a little bit different than what's recommended. So, what's typically recommended is to process them between around 8 weeks on average. Some people go earlier when they don't want larger birds. Now, the risk they say is if you let them grow more than 8 weeks, that their legs will break, that they're not bred to get older, that essentially they stop walking around, they become really unhealthy. And that may be the case if you're raising them in confinement, which a lot of people are. I mean, all commercial meat operations are raising them in complete confinement. We pasture raise ours. I've never had a Cornish cross break a leg. I've never had them just drop dead the way people say they do. So we actually raise ours to 10 weeks. So that's our cutoff. Maybe we'll go up to a week over that, but we don't like to because we don't want them to get too big. And at that point, we are dressing out, but on average, 8-pound birds, up to 10 pounds at 10 weeks. I've had some, specifically like the roosters will get bigger, obviously, than the hens. But I've had 10-pound chickens raising them in 10 weeks, pasturing them.
Right, exactly, and so that's where, like, if you look at pictures, right, from, say, like, the 1920s when kind of all of this stuff was just being born to, like, the early 1950s following the Chicken of Tomorrow activity and the breeding programs and the efforts that went there versus the modern kind of conventionally raised chicken of today, which, I was looking at it, it's like, yeah, it's 8 weeks is typically the recommended age so that you have peak feed conversion,
Mhm.
and your hanging weight is typically gonna be between 5 and 6 pounds,
6.
which
Mhm.
for a consumer is kind of seen as the ideal weight for a bird that you're buying, and so that is what has happened as you look at the progression of the last 100 years in terms of the impact of these breeding programs, but it just wasn't just the breeding programs. The whole industry started to professionalize and improve, and lots of things started to contribute to these bigger and bigger birds that were making this a bigger and bigger industry.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes complete sense. I mean, for us, the reason we choose to raise our birds at home the way we do is because I've got, at this point, 4 sons at home. At one point, I had 6 children in my house, that I was feeding, and it's that extra couple weeks of raising them out and having an 8 to 10-pound bird versus a 5 to 6-pound bird depends that determines whether I can cook dinner with 1 chicken or 2 to have to feed everybody, so that's what we raise them that way to meet our needs. Once my children are grown, we'll probably pare it back, so it'll just be the 2 of us. But yeah, that makes complete sense, 'cause comparatively, when you take that 10-week Cornish cross and compare it to that 18-week Rhode Island Red, you're looking at just a completely different piece of food
Yeah,
to
I mean, it's
make.
almost hard to argue that they're the same species. Like, like, you
Yeah.
look at what older Cornish cross, like what you're describing is versus, yeah, like one of my egg-laying pullets that I just put out into the broader egg-laying flock in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
They're very different in terms of look, size, behavior, everything about it. Um,
Yes, I agree.
but with these bigger birds, you started to actually now have a professionalized industry. And so that's when a lot of these larger companies started to spring up. So the Purdue's and the Tysons of the world, where were these enterprises that focused on controlling the entire supply chain, going from the breeding all the way to the processing and ultimately distribution into the supermarkets. And kind of that combination. So the genetics plus the professionalization of the supply chain, I guess you call it, is what led it to be like by the 1950s, chicken becoming a staple that any American could find in their market or store like locally.
Hmm. That's really I mean, that's very interesting.
Yeah,
So
I
at
mean,
that point, the competition or the Chicken of Tomorrow competition, that was around that when was that?
that
You
was
said
1948, and so then that
1948.
springboarded this growth, and so
Mhm.
that plus the green ag revolution and a lot of agricultural technologies that arose following World War II, those things were the big shift. And I think the control of the supply chain might sound like a more boring element, but when you think about it, particularly what it takes to raise chickens, that I think actually played a more important role because, like, Jess, for folks who aren't familiar, what would you say the difference between raising chickens is versus beef in terms of what you as the farmer need to do to raise those animals?
This is a lot more intensive. So, like, for the beef, obviously, we have our cows, they're out on the pasture, and where we do manage them, we manage the pasture, we manage their minerals and stuff like that. They're 100% grass fed, and it takes 2 years to raise out a steer. I mean, hanging weight on a good sized steer, you're looking at several 100 pounds of beef. That the input, there wasn't a lot of grain that went into it. There really wasn't a lot of day-to-day work that went into it other than maybe a little bit of pasture management, mineral load management, all of that. For the most part, I would call raising beef relatively hands-off work, especially if you have good grass. Um for chickens, and of course, we do try to raise them a more natural way to bring the sustainability in a little bit, but we're moving fences daily, electric fences, moving them to new pastures. We're feeding grain. It's very grain intensive to raise them. And yeah, I mean, like when people ask me what's the most sustainable chicken, I'm like, you need to just stop viewing chicken as sustainable. You can grow it and raise it. We do. And we raise 100 chickens a year for our family. So I mean, we're eating chicken pretty frequently, but it's definitely in my mind, it's not a sustainable meat source and it's not an affordable meat source, really. Like, I mean, it's a treat. It's something that we eat because of preference, not at all because it's what makes the most sense.
And that's exactly right. And so that big difference about what does a cow eat versus what does a chicken eat makes a massive difference in terms of how you need to think about it. And the difference in the time and lifespan also changes because again, think about that chicken breeding program that we were just talking about. To get, say, 20 generations of a chicken changed over, in theory, if you were doing it aggressively enough, you could probably do that in about 5 years,
Yeah,
right? Where you're 20 generations removed from your original chicken. To do that with cattle, it takes a much longer time, right?
sure.
Where, you know, you could maybe start breeding your heifers after about a year, which would be strongly advised against. You're better off
Yeah,
2 years. It's a 9 month gestation period. And
yeah,
so like the cycle of going from generation to generation on cattle takes a lot longer time. Like for this upcoming spring, I'm hoping to have my third generation of cattle born on my farm that I've been raising personally. And I've been
yep,
doing this for almost 5 years. And so that shift of like speed through going through generations plays a role, but then that reliance on grain to feed your animals plays the other role. And so when you think about a big production company like a Tyson or a Purdue, you need to be thinking about your breeding program and where are those chickens coming from and where are your good chicken genetics coming from. And if you can control that, and then you can control where the feed's coming from, and then you can control the processing and distribution part, you can have people like farmers play roles in between, but and so you don't have to manage everything and have all the liability that you might have if you try to truly run the process from end to end. But who do you think's controlling that process if you have each of those major points along the way? And I don't know if that makes sense, but it
yeah,
was
it
it was
does.
sort of one of those supply chain ahas for me as I was getting into the research on this one as well.
This is actually a really controversial thing in the homesteading world. Like, there are a lot of arguments that arise over whether raising Cornish crosses are even ethical or if it's sustainable or all of that. Like, and again, I mean, it brings me back to where I stand on it, which is like, it's not sustainable. Like, I think that how you treat the individual animals determines the ethics of it. Like, I don't find it unethical if I'm caring for my animals in a way that I feel good about. But yeah, like, it is very controversial. Like, a lot of people refuse to raise Cornish crosses because of how strongly held that supply chain is by the provider of those birds.
And I'll actually put myself as one of those people out there who, I mean, I don't see it as wrong, but I personally would rather
Don't wanna take
make
part.
my chicken consumption be the byproduct of my egg production and
Yeah,
like have it be almost kind of more old fashioned where it's like I'm not really raising chickens to raise chickens. I'm just raising my own egg layers and half the eggs you hatch on your farm are going to end up being roosters and you
yeah.
can't have that many roosters for the health of your flock, so I got to butcher them anyway. Let me just do it in a way that actually can add some food to the table too, is basically how I'm approaching it. And so it's not necessarily to say I see anything wrong with the Cornish cross, but trying to say, well, what's the right ethics for how I want to consume most of my chicken and where do I want the
Yeah.
chicken that I'm serving come from?
I mean, honestly, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, like, once I'm not feeding as many children, like, I just have to take that into consideration. There's a very good chance that we'll do the very same thing, like, just process excess roosters. It's fine. We don't need it to be several pounds of meat for just 2 people. Um, I mean, I definitely see why some people opt out of that. It is kind of a touchy thing, and I think a lot of people don't realize, like, that this industry is. I didn't realize it was so young. I knew that looking back on history, I read a lot of historical fiction, people weren't eating a lot of chickens. I don't think I realized how recently this developed, though. This is very recent.
Very, very recent. And so, and it's funny. So, like, my dad was born in 1950. And so I'm going to pick up the story right around there because in 1952, Colonel Harlan Sanders founded a little company known as Kentucky Fried Chicken.
I'm Colonel Harold Sanders, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about my Kentucky Fried Chicken. We always use plump, young broilers, always fresh, never frozen chicken.
Which really started to become the first brand of nationally known chicken. And then when you had them, plus the rise of McDonald's in the 1960s, and when they ultimately introduced the chicken nugget.
Introducing Chicken McNuggets. McDonald's new McNuggets. A McNugget is a boneless chunk of tender, tasty chicken with 4 kinds of sauce to choose, especially for dipping.
And just the whole fast food industry in general,
Yeah.
that helped introduce a food that, to your point, wasn't historically a major part of the American diet. It started to rise in prominence in a significant way between, say, like 1950 and 1970, 1980, somewhere like that.
Well, like, doesn't Chick-fil-A tout having kinda invented the chicken sandwich?
Yes.
And I do actually remember a conversation, now that we're talking about this, where there used to be, like, the big banner in front of Chick-fil-A that said the original chicken sandwich, and I remember going in with my brother when we were, I don't know, teenagers. It was at the mall back when that was the only place where Chick-fil-A's were, and, I remember us talking about this and being like, "Do you really think they had the first chicken sandwich?" Like, we were like, "That's unlikely," but actually, it probably was really likely if that wasn't a super common thing back then. I mean, like, if chicken was really on that scale just being introduced to the market, then sure, the first chicken sandwich was up for grabs, you know?
Oh, completely. And the truth of the matter is that is like, there's like a little bit of dispute. It's like, oh, maybe these guys over here did it like 6 months before or not. But like in terms of the era when chicken sandwiches arose, Chick-fil-A was right there. And so I think that that's a fair argument. I think the other interesting thing that happened too is particularly related to fast food. When you have this demand for fast food, the most important thing for fast food is consistency and standardization and quick production. And so that is what gave rise to the other wildly popular thing that I think really just only sprung up when we were kids, the chicken nugget.
Right. Yeah.
Because what's for those who don't know, what is a chicken nugget? What part of the chicken does it come from?
Chicken nuggets are nothing but pink slime. Grind all those chicken parts together and extrude them into chicken-looking shapes. But it's nothing but pink slime. Pink slime. Chicken nuggets are nothing but pink slime.
Well, I mean, I think originally it probably came from breast meat. But now, who knows what's in some of those? If it's shaped like a dinosaur, I can't vouch for the contents.
Welcome to Jurassic
I actually, I might be wrong on this one, but I actually think it happened the other way around, where
Oh, really? It started
originally
from, like,
the
top.
chicken nugget was just like all of the leftover scrap,
I see.
ground
Pressed
down,
together.
cooked, extruded out as like some sort of pink sludge into like the 4 shapes that McDonald's uses for their chicken
Yeah.
McNuggets. And that was the start. I think a lot of like people have actually been grossed out by that and decided to say, oh no, we only do white meat or like
I
breast
see.
meat chicken. Like that's actually something you haven't even seen, and it really only gave rise like in the last 20 years or
So
so.
the nugget was the solution to the byproducts of cutting out the fillets for the chicken sandwiches type situation.
The chicken equivalent of sausage,
Yeah. Yeah. Which that makes sense.
Which I mean, again, for folks who are out there who are focused on sustainability, I know some people get really grossed out by that idea that I'm eating all the random grind and other stuff that comes out of the bird. Honestly, that's actually the more sustainable way to eat it, where you're trying to maximize the use of the entire animal.
Yeah. If you've ever made head cheese when you process a hog, like there's definitely, this is not a new idea. You don't waste anything. And I think that honors the animal, but I understand that it's not necessarily palatable to our modern thinking.
Exactly, exactly. It's one of those things where I do feel, like, heartened a little bit when I see, like, kind of the modern foodie movement where that, like, what's the, like, rooter to tutor kind of, like, eating the whole hog, like, that type of concept, which has grown in popularity in the last, like, 10, 20 years. I think that has actually been a positive just because it does make people a little bit less squeamish to try something like head cheese.
Which there is a difference too, though. Like, for instance, we use everything that when we process animals, even down to like composting the blood and the feathers of chickens. And, like we use all of the hog and everything. But when you're processing one animal or a flock of animals on your own farm, and then you're taking all those odds and ends pieces and you're making them into things, that is admittedly a little less gross than the commercialization of all of this stuff being thrown into a grinder and squeezed into a boot shape and fried as a chicken nugget. Like, I mean, that is like that's a little different.
You're no, I think you're right. Like, I mean, like, as I was saying earlier, when it came to, we just did a chicken butchering here a couple weeks ago, and the chickens themselves go into the freezer. When we eat them, I'll typically do like a roast chicken and then take the carcass and the bones and throw that in a pot and make stock out of it. And so feel like I'm maximizing use there. Chicken feet either turn into dog treats or into stock themselves.
Uh-huh.
The organ meat is most of it is actually ending up into the dog food I made for the dogs or cat food that I'm making for the cats. And then like the feathers are actually probably the only thing I don't really feathers and like intestines are like the only things I don't put
Mhm.
really good use to, and that just ends up feeding the coyotes, and I like dump it off in the
Yeah.
far back corner of the farm sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, we put feathers and all that stuff in our compost bins. I guess some of the intestines and stuff, I mean, it ends up getting fed back to the farm,
Yeah.
like in one way or another. So yeah,
Oh,
it's all in
when
this
I've
circle.
butchered yeah, I mean, that's actually the other thing when it comes to, like, pigs and chickens being complementary. When I've butchered pigs on the farm, I will often take some of the real waste product that I wouldn't have, like, for either human or dog consumption and end up feeding that to the chickens. And as I've butchered chickens or geese or ducks on the
Mhm.
farm and have hogs, they would get all the feathers, they would get all the intestines, all that. That would typically go to the hogs is usually how I'll feed it.
Yeah, that's what we do too.
Yeah. But fast food did bring this rise of availability, and it got people much more normalized and used to eating things like chicken and, that finger licking good vibe that people often pictured. Like that became a cultural phenomena to the point where, as for us as people born in the 80s, I just always assumed chicken was like KFC and it was popular like that. That wasn't really even a thing that was happening, like, say, when my dad was a kid, which is kind of surprising to me.
Yeah. Well, I know that for my family, I remember being told that when they were kids, like fried chicken was a big deal. Like that was like what you asked for like your birthday dinner. It was very much a special occasion meal to fry a chicken. And I think actually that may have been some of the appeal of fast food because if you've ever fried anything, you understand that it's pretty extensive. I mean, one, fat and oil is not necessarily a super cheap input, like people don't necessarily think about that, but to really fry a bird, you have to have a good deal of fat or oil. And then it's messy and it's time consuming. It's not a quick meal. It's something you put a lot of work into. And so fast food and fried chicken that you could get from a fast food place, that's a very convenient offering if you've ever done that from scratch.
Right. Yeah. No, it's like it's definitely a Sunday afternoon to make your family fried chicken. Like that's
Yeah.
you know,
That's
from
like my
parting
number one favorite comfort food in the world is fried chicken, by the
yeah.
way, and I can fry chicken really well. I just don't do it very much because it's just
It's a
awful.
pain in the butt.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of ironic too, though, because fast food was one of the reasons why chicken got so popular, but the diet industry and health fads were actually the other reason that happened pretty much like right on the heels of that. So you had the
Yeah.
rise of fast food in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. And then in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you had things like the US Dietary Guidelines in 1977 being adjusted to reduce the consumption of red meat for better health. It suggested eating more lean, like quote
Yeah.
unquote lean proteins like chicken.
Feel like chicken tonight, like chicken tonight. New Chicken Tonight simmer sauces from Ragu.
And kind of the idea of white meat being healthier and perceived as being, better for heart health specifically, like those types of things. Weight Watchers and other diet plans really tried to promote chicken over things like pork and beef. And even the pork industry, like in the 90s, got in on this idea of, well, we're not like red meat like beef either. We're white meat like chicken. And that's like another thing that sort of shaped the American perception of health and connected healthy food to chicken as a concept in and of itself.
Yeah, that's what when I say I remember, like, chicken not being as popular of a thing to eat, like, I'm thinking back to, like, the '90s. I remember very strongly whenever it became more commonly believed that beef was bad and chicken was good. Like, it was I very vividly remember I know I was young, I mean, I was a teenager and stuff when all that was going on, or young teenager, but I remember that shift happening in our culture, to the point that now it's interesting now whenever you're like went through a big health thing a couple years ago, and I did a stint of carnivore to help heal my gut from some antibiotic injuries and some different things, and specifically, my parents' generation could not wrap their head around the fact that I was eating beef for my health. It's like, what? So
Well, and I mean, and I think that that's the thing because like, I think about like my mom always like trying to promote like healthy foods. And it was like, that was where the rise of the boneless, skinless chicken breast, which is like
breast, that's
just this like amorphous protein orb that people would cook or even grill on like their George Foreman
George Foreman.
grills. And like I even remember like my earliest days after graduating college and like living on my own for the first time. I had a Foreman grill and I would like grill those like horrible boneless, skinless chicken breasts and be like, oh yeah, I'm eating healthy. Look, see, it was just like it was the
Was it
worst
the
food you could
IQF ones, like the individually quick frozen ones that you would get in the bag at the store? Did you do that?
No,
Or were you
they were
buying
just
it
like
fresh?
the Purdue like styrofoam
Yeah.
packs of like, 3 or 4 pink orbs that you would just like take, throw some spices on it, and then throw it on the Foreman, and then like dip it in some barbecue sauce or some
Yep.
nonsense like
So
that.
so for me, it was IQF, and it was probably just being on a really tight budget, but, like, I very vividly remember my first apartment was outfitted with a George Foreman grill, and I would buy those bags of chicken breasts that were individually quick frozen where you could take 2 and put them on a plate and thaw them out, and then season them, George Foreman grill, barbecue sauce, that was it.
I mean, that was it,
That
right?
was
And that was like, oh, this is a reasonably good, healthy meal I can cook, and just it's funny as I've learned actually how to cook food and like do stuff, particularly with stuff from the farm. It has me just like shaking my head like, oh, that was the worst I could have ever done. Like that was just not that it's
Okay, so
unhealthy, but just gross.
do you eat much chicken breast now? Like, is that
um,
something that's, like, a routine thing in your diet?
No, I mean, like, a chicken breast, no. Like,
No.
for example, tonight, I just there 2 days ago, put one of the chickens that we butchered out of the freezer and into the fridge, and so probably around, I don't know, 4:30, 5 o'clock, I'll pull it out, rub it down with some seasons, spatchcock it, and toss it in the oven, and I'll do the whole chicken, and so I might eat the breast in that context, but, like,
Right.
to buy a package of chicken breasts, I don't think I've done that in
Yeah.
easily 10 years or more.
Yeah. I mean, same thing for us, like, I very rarely am cooking chicken parts for the most part, we're just cooking whole chickens, and sometimes I'll piece them out, whenever we're processing. But, yeah, the idea of just sitting down and eating chicken breasts, like, as my family, one, if I sat down and set everybody down with their own chicken breast, I mean, that's literally, that's like 4 chickens. Like, that's
I
crazy.
Which, again, if you wanna think about what sort of the rise of factory farming and the factory production of chickens did is, 1, it reduced the cost of the meat and drove it down to the point where you could do something like that. 2, because you have all of these different outlets, a company like Tyson can take all of the breasts from their chickens and sell them as breasts. They can
Mhm.
take all of the thighs or drumsticks and sell them as that, sell the wings as chicken wings to be sold at a bar or, on Super
Mhm.
Bowl, or, like take all the scraps and leavings and turn those into dino nuggets. And so like,
Mhm.
as an industry, they figured out a path for each part of the chicken versus the traditional way being you have a whole bird, you either part that bird up yourself or you cook the whole bird yourself, or you have like maybe 3 or 4 different uses for that one bird at your house.
Yeah. Yeah, that is definitely I mean, it's raising that ourselves is probably reverted us to a much more old school way of doing things because
I think the struggle personally see as I look at the chicken industry today, and I think the same thing goes for turkeys too, where you have this animal that is heavily grain reliant, and so the carbon footprint of a chicken, I will argue, people, is significantly worse than say a cow or a sheep.
Mhm.
The grain that has to be produced and what has to be produced, like brought in and trucked in and produced, the biodiversity that gets destroyed by the land that needs to be raised for that green versus say the diversity of a traditional like integrated pasture. And then on top of it all, you have things like water pollution, that when you look at those warehouses where a lot of these chickens that folks are eating today are raised, they produce a whole heck of a lot of manure and a whole heck of a lot of wastewater that actually creates a lot of problems, like when you see the nitrogen blooms and problems that a lot of our waterways are having or that are happening down in the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of that's actually directly related to chicken production.
Yeah, that's not surprising. So, what happened as far as is there anything that you found in researching you said 2010, I think, is whenever it overtook beef as the most popular meat source. Is this just a result of it becoming so normal in our culture that nobody even thinks twice about it? And it
I think
just
I think so. I mean, and it was
yeah.
it was a degree sets of steps, right? Like, so
Yeah.
go back again. It's only been 101 years since Celia Steele's accident. And so you had it being chicken being an extremely rare specialty food, to people starting to have it as a luxury food, to it's starting to dominate the plate as a fast food, to the point that, our collective culinary memories, I feel like, are always very short, right? Like, you
Mhm.
only know what you know, and maybe what your parents know, and maybe what your grandparents know. And so going back those 3 generations, like, I think my grandfather was born in like 1922. And
Yeah.
so it was in his entire lifetime where chicken went from not being a thing to a thing. I don't know what my great grandfather used to have, and so I don't even have that, like, food culinary memory in terms of how I'm thinking of stuff. And so it just you see it become so commonplace, and it becomes just such a core part of how people do dinner, that I think that that's why people see it as the ubiquitous thing that it is today.
Yeah, I would say that chicken is the topic food-wise that is the most different between, like, us trying to live more sustainably and most of my friends that don't grow their own food, like, they definitely eat way more chicken than we do, and I think that I mean, it's readily available, it's safe, it's what a lot of picky eaters eat, and it is I mean, at this point, it is one of the more affordable protein sources that you can go in the store and buy.
Exactly, and I'll say this too, I have as a life goal of trying to get the world to eat more goose, because of all the poultry, I see goose as arguably the most sustainable form of poultry. It's still not as good as beef. It's still not as good as sheep or goats, even like. But when you start to like sort of more traditional grazing herbivores or ruminants, I guess technically, but for geese, like especially the geese we raise on our farm here for meat, the first 4 or so weeks of their lives, you need to give goslings a fair amount of protein to get them started and going on the right way. But pretty much from week 5 to week 16, the geese that we're raising on the farm are getting very little grain, if any, and they're mostly existing off of grasses and other plants like forbs, to actually grow and produce that meat. And so their diet looks much more like a sheep than it does look like, say, a chicken or turkey. And so I wish the world was eating more goose. Not to say it's as good as a true ruminant, it's better because of what it does from that carbon footprint and the grain consumption side of things.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's gotta be the only bird that you can largely raise pasturing. I mean, ducks still require a good bill of grain, don't they?
Yeah, I mean,
I've only raised them once, but we fed ours grain very regularly.
yeah, I mean, so right now we've got about 30 ducks on the farm and probably about 50 chickens, and the ducks per bird are eating probably about 15 to 20% more of grain than the chickens do. And particularly when you get into the colder months, they eat even more than that. And so, yeah, ducks aren't even the same way as the geese. The geese are really unique. I think the reason that we as a society don't eat goose meat like we eat chicken meat comes down to the fact that they're harder to produce in a factory setting, they're harder to
Mhm.
hatch, and then in terms of processing, like plucking and getting
Mhm.
a good clean bird, they're a lot more work relative to, say, a turkey or a chicken.
It really begs the question. I mean, I know this is supposed to be the conclusion, but, like, it's kind of like, should we be going along with this? Probably isn't great for the earth, actually.
Yeah, I mean, but honestly, the thing that in thinking about all of this that it has me thinking about is, since so much change in such a relatively short period of time, and I don't feel like if I look collectively where we're at today versus where we were 100 years ago, if it necessarily truly, like in total, netted out to be a positive change. I think there were some good things that happened, but as a whole, it might have actually left us in a worse place. What I wonder is, well, would there be other ways to change either the chicken industry or some other food source industry in a similar way for the better? And like maybe it's not as hard as we think to raise more sustainable forms of food when you look at how quickly things change and all you really need is some sort of contest hosted by A&P grocery store to get better genetics, and there we are.
I didn't know all of the details of this. I didn't know the way that this industry grew and with such change so fast, and it's hilarious that it started on an accident on an order form. But it is something to ponder, like, "Hey, this could change in this direction this quick. Maybe we could change it in a more positive direction."
Definitely.
Um, but I think being mindful is obviously the first step to any real change.
Hey, McMurray, you still farming chickens, eh?
Oh, chicken breed by day, chicken dance by night.